On August the 7th, 1985, police were called to Whitehouse farm in Essex. Here, they made the gruesome discovery that the entire family inside the farmhouse had been shot to death. The victims were 61-year-old Nevill and June Bamber, their 28-year-old daughter Sheila Caffell, and her 6-year-old twin sons, Nicholas and Daniel. Initially, the police believed it was a murder-suicide, with Sheila being the responsible party. But then a witness came forward and new information came to light that seemed to suggest that Jeremy Bamber, Nevill and June's son and Sheila's brother, had in fact carried out the gruesome killings. This tale is one of many twists and turns. And at the end, maybe the ideas and opinions you'll have had before I tell this story will have shifted. Maybe they won't. Either way, it's a long one, guys. And with that, I'll be breaking it down into two parts because I really did need to diligently research this and make sure that I looked at every single avenue where the research was concerned to give you the best outline of this story. This is the case of the Whitehouse farm murders and Jeremy Bamber. Somebody who many people believe was simply a deceptively charming man who almost got away with the brutal slaughter of his family. But some, well, they remain very, very unconvinced by that. Hi guys, welcome to today's true crime story. I'm going to be doing this in two parts for good reason. It's long. I've really tried to avoid doing this case, okay? I'm going to say that. But so many of you have asked for this time and time and time again. And what's prevented me from doing it is because there's so much speculation around this case and there are so many questions. Sometimes it feels like there are more questions than answers. And with that, it takes quite a lot of research and time. And also, I never want to upset people. And I appreciate that some people where the Whitehouse farm murders are concerned have got some very clear views, and therefore what I say and how I come across in this video could be upsetting for certain individuals, and I never want to do that. So it's one of those things that I have talked about to my partner and I've thought about professionally and channel-wise, and eventually you guys win, because it's one of those things you've asked me to deep dive and I knew it was going to be a big one, but ultimately it has surprised me. And it's surprised me for a lot of reasons that I will talk about throughout this case. Bear in mind, there are lots of cases where I am clearly highly biased. And before I get into the Jeremy Bamber Whitehouse farm murders case, I want to make it clear, I have worked in the media for going on 2 decades. I have presented and been an expert on hundreds of crime documentaries. It is where I've cut my teeth. I'm a late beginner to YouTube. I was the MSM. And up until about 5 years ago, I believed that whatever I saw on TV was the truth. And I know that for some people that will speak of a naivety that is surprising, but maybe I just wanted to feel naive and a believer in the world around me. Only in the last few years have I been far more objective about that reality. And part of that is to do with the fact that I do YouTube, and therefore I've revisited a lot of the cases that I worked on documentaries on. And when you work on documentaries, one of the things that happens is you will be employed to do a particular job. In my job, it was being a psychologist and a commentator or a presenter. During that experience, obviously, we cover lots of cases, particularly when you're doing a series where you might be doing 30 different individual cases, as I would do every season of Britain's Darkest Taboos. And therefore, when people give you the research, the idea is that those researchers have cut out the middleman. So I don't have to do that work because I can trust you to have done it. It's only when I started YouTube and really started to deep dive into the cases, I realized that so many of the things that I was told about cases were incorrect. And it's been disturbing for me. That's why I've revisited a lot of the cases that I've covered on TV so that I can tell, in my opinion, the best truth possible. When it comes down to Jeremy Bamber, I will go on record as saying that I am on record saying that I think this guy's a narcissist and that I think that he is responsible for these killings because, like I said, you cut out the middleman. You get the research from the researchers, you trust that that has been diligently done, because your role is not to do that. Your job is to understand and digest and then comment or present. But on reflection, I wish I had had the mindset that I have today. And that isn't because I'm about to tell you that I think Sheila Bamber is innocent. Let me be clear from the get-go. This is about me asking a question. And the question is there reasonable doubt? And at the end of this, you may feel there isn't. And at the end of this, you may feel there is. But I went on record saying there is no doubt. And so today, I want to really go into whether that opinion stands the test of time, or indeed whether my opinion has changed because of going through this case. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. As ever, let me know in the comments because it really helps me. But that's why I am breaking this into a two-parter. I need to know that I have done my best when looking at this case. I'm also going to quote a few different people. I'm also going to talk about the fact that I've used Sheila Caffell's book for some of the background information because his opinions come into it. I've also been looking at a new, very relevant New Yorker piece, which is pretty revealing. I've kind of put all of this together so that I can hopefully give you every angle of the story and you can make your own minds up. So let's talk about Nevill Bamber. So Nevill Bamber is the father in this case and the grandfather of the two 6-year-old twins. He was born in 1924. And then in 1941, at the age of 17, he becomes a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force. This is during World War II, where he actually flew hurricanes. And I think we can all agree that would have been a very, very dangerous job and takes the relatively heroic mindset, certainly a resilient mindset, somebody who is potentially quite a stoic individual as well to be able to carry out such kind of opportunities job-wise. Now he actually, and sadly for him, sustained a very severe back injury because his plane was shot down. I kid you not. So not only is he a pilot, he actually gets shot down during World War II. And it took him about 2 years to recover from. Then in September 1947, obviously his career in the forces has ended because of that injury. So he ends up going to the Royal Agricultural College in Cirencester. Now, after the war, he meets June Speakman. And June had actually also been born in 1924. And she came from a family of farmers. And I'm sure that a lot of you around the world who watch this channel will be aware that when you were a farmer, very often it is a family thing. So there's a traditional element within it. So often you will see the history of farming areas with farmers within those areas passing down the farm to their offspring, essentially, or at least members of their family. It's very, very difficult to work as a farmer. It's hard, but it's also incredibly fruitful and very healthy and often leads to long lives of the individuals who do it because it's manual and it's also business orientated. So you can understand that for somebody like June, who's come from a family of farmers, she's probably got a keen interest in meeting somebody who reflects that kind of work and work ethic. Now, when she met him, she was working as a secretary, but she'd actually been part of the first age nursing yeomanry during the war, and she'd actually gone to India during this time, so she's relatively well travelled. Now, on September the 3rd, 1949, Nevill and June go through the lovely celebration of getting married. And they live together at this point in a Georgian farmhouse in Tollershunt, Darcy, Essex, known as Whitehouse Farm. Now, the thing about that particular Whitehouse farm, the house there, it has a bit of a difficult history. So the occupant, before the Bambers moved there, had actually drowned himself in a water tank. And his father had also died by suicide, drinking poison in his room. I don't know about you. It always concerns me a little bit moving to places with that kind of history, but I suppose everyone's different. I suppose somebody lives in Dharma's flat. It's just not for me. That's all I'm saying. I kind of like to think that good things have happened where I live. Now, in addition to working as a farmer, because that's what Neville is doing now, he later became a magistrate. He was also working as a parish councillor. They were described by people who knew them as pillars of the community. They did a lot for the village. They were very much upstanding individuals, and they were celebrated as those upstanding individuals. They were very devout as well. June, in particular, highly devout in her religion. So they were individuals who were respected because They lived by a particular moral standard. And the locals who knew Nevill and June said they were genuinely good people who had literally a good word for everybody, and in turn everybody had a good word for them. They were very nice people, they were incredibly kind, they were incredibly considerate. And one neighbour actually was quoted as saying, whenever Mrs. Bamber heard that anyone in the village was sick, she was always straight round to see them. She encouraged and helped everybody. So we are having a picture painted of tranquil village life with a community spirit where this couple have been together a long time and are also just good through to the core, as far as the outside perceptions of those who know them are concerned. But it's also really important to be balanced here. June had actually been really devastated to some degree at times in her life by mental illness. And part of that is to do with some of the grief that she experienced, which was a blight on her life, essentially. So soon after their wedding, she struggled to conceive. And we have to remember, we're talking about her being born in the 1920s and growing up through a period of post-war and pre-war experience, but society was very different to how it is now, and we're all aware of that. We're all aware that we live in a far more liberal time, but back then, becoming a housewife and being a dutiful partner, these were things that were just par for the course for most women, particularly women in the UK, I'm sure the same in America, Australia, the Western world, but this was just norm. And to not be able to have children, that could feel like a real punishment because we didn't have the systems in place where IVF was possible. If you were infertile, if you struggled to conceive and you couldn't have children naturally, you weren't going to have kids. And when you want to create a family unit, that can be devastating. And you can imagine on a mental health level, it can just absolutely wreak havoc on your mental health. And this grief apparently consumed her. She'd been hospitalized with depression, she was hospitalized with psychosis and paranoia, and she even went through multiple courses of electroshock therapy. Now, some people will say, well, I think electroshock therapy is good because today ECT is not as aggressive and violent as it was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But let me tell you, it did untold damage to many, many people. It literally destroyed areas of the brain in many people who went through that. And it's pretty harrowing to me that those kind of things took place. These days, I would say there is a lighter effect that ECT offers in the fact that it isn't as aggressive, it's a much more nuanced, it's much more approached with certain key areas being identified and it being used on. I would say still the jury is seriously out where this kind of therapy is concerned, and it can do real harm. And in my experience, I've had lots of case studies where that's been the case. So you can imagine that that's what's going on. She's got these deep-rooted feelings and they're trying to shock her brain to remove them. You can't do that. You have to work through grief. It's really awful being infertile. I am one of those people. I have the blessings of medical intervention and IVF, thank you. But the point is this, for her, it wasn't possible. It was devastating. And no amount of shock therapy is going to make you come to your senses when you actually want to have children, and you want biological children in particular. Now, her psychiatrist ended up down the line telling the police that she had a real distortion of some very strong religious beliefs that was caused by this feeling of being left rendered. Now, her psychiatrist down the line actually spoke to the police. This is after the deaths that occurred. And that psychiatrist actually told police down the line after she had been killed that her illness had caused a, quote, distortion of her already strong religious beliefs, so that she essentially saw everything in terms of good and evil. So basically what she's saying there is she's being punished. Something has happened and there is a reason why God hasn't allowed her to have her children. And that is a massive delusion and a big distortion, but it's one that she absolutely bought into. And it also transpired that therefore, that's how she saw the world around her. It was good or it was bad. And you can imagine with such rigidity, there are problems, particularly problems when you're bringing up children that you might decide to take into your life. Because children are not good and are not bad. Most of the time they're somewhere in between. They're figuring out who they are, they're forming and forging the kind of human beings they're going to become. And they need guidance, not rigid realities that you do this or you do that, and either one of those will depict whether you are good or evil. It can be really problematic. Neville, he was said to be an absolute gentleman. He was said to be really approachable. He was said to have this really great sense of humour. He was very wise. And like I said, both of them were very devout. June actually became the church warden, so very much involved in church life. And as I said, the couple desperately wanted kids, but they couldn't have any. So then they end up looking into adoption. And so they start beginning that process through their church. And in 1957, they get the best news, and that is that they can adopt a baby girl. And they do, in fact, go ahead and do that. And they call her Sheila Jane. And I think for any mother, when you are given the opportunity to be that mother physically, because I think we always feel like mothers, those of us who want children, even when our babies haven't arrived, when finally you get to hold that child in your arms, it just brings into fruition all of those feelings that you've been hoarding and hosting, but that have no channel to go to. And you have all these hopes and dreams. But you also, when you're dealing with an adopted child, are potentially entertaining some bigger struggles than you would entertain if you were just having a child of your own physically. Because understandably, there is a transitional process, there can be attachment issues. And so even if you've got this idea of how mothering is going to be, it can be very different. I mean, it can be very different when you have a biological child. Of course it can. But I think there are additional struggles often where adoption is concerned, and that's testament to the amazing people who adopt children and bring them up and help them thrive and heal the wounds that those initial rejections can create. Now, in 1958, June is also struggling with depression. She ends up going to a private psychiatric hospital. She's getting more electric shock therapy, and Sheila is a baby at this point. Again, that's going to compound attachment issues. So if your primary carer has rejected you, and I understand that people choose to have children adopted for lots of reasons, it doesn't make them a bad person, but it is a rejection no matter what the reasoning behind that. And for the child, having to manage that rejection at a point where they're non-verbal, at a point where they have no control, that's very challenging emotionally. But then add to that your mother isn't available to you when you're a baby, as in the adopted mother, because she's back in hospital because she's severely depressed, she's getting ECT, and she's essentially absent from your life. And one of the big motivations for her going to hospital is that June basically had this belief that she was going to do terrible harm to her daughter. And that must have been terrifying for her. So Sheila is having a difficult start to life, is what I am saying. And as I noted before, one of the problems with the depression is it manifests in this idea that there is good or bad. And the way that June is going to treat Sheila as she grows up falls into that category. In fact, there are reports that said that she used to be referred to as the devil child. So that's how June would look at Sheila. And she was allegedly constantly disappointed by her flirtatious behaviour, by the fact that she was super pretty. I mean, Sheila grew up into a gorgeous young woman. And so ultimately, that means that she's going to attract certain people, and those people are going to notice her, and she's probably going to enjoy that. And her mother, June, couldn't stand it because she felt that that made her a bit of a Jezebel, essentially. But that pathology that the psychiatrist is talking about is deeply damaging, because what we need, particularly when we've had a fractured start to our experience because we're adopted, is a parent and primary caregiver who makes us feel super special, who makes us feel like we'll never be abandoned again, who helps to heal those attachment issues, who makes us have a sense that our environment is a secure environment and always will be. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that June and Neville were bad parents, because ultimately it seems they did a lot to support their children. I'm saying that everybody is imperfect. And if your imperfection happens to pathologize your world into this idea of good and evil, and you need to categorize one of your children potentially in the evil category, that is going to be deeply problematic for your relationship and also for the child growing up, because they have now this reputation in your mindset, and you will play out your idea and delusion about that on the way that you treat them. And that could be deeply damaging. Now, in spite of these teething issues, shall we say, with parenting where June's concerned, nonetheless, on January the 13th, 1961, a baby boy was born, and he gets subsequently put up for adoption. Now, his biological father, would you believe it, was a senior Buckingham Palace official, and he'd conceived this child during an affair, and he was taken to the Bambers when he was 6 years old and was named Jeremy Neville. And that's how Jeremy Nevill Bamber enters the family. So 6 weeks old, and like I said, again, a turbulent start to his life. Sheila and Jeremy are given the best of everything to some degree. I'm not saying it's perfect where the parenting is concerned. And I think that ultimately when you are a farmer and a business person, like Neville was, as warm and as lovely as you are, you're also going to be incredibly busy. And I believe that somebody like Neville, and certainly June, would have had a mindset where they expect their children to succeed. And I think that that would be very important to them. They want to give those children the best start in life, but they also want to have payback. An idea that they've invested in the young people that they're bringing up and that they are going to grow into young adults who are going to prove that all of that hard work and all of that pain at the beginning of the infertility has come to fruition as something really positive. But it's challenging for them. Now, they send Sheila and Jeremy to private school. Jeremy in 1970 goes to Gresham's School in Norfolk. It is a boarding school, but he didn't actually receive any qualifications. Bear in mind, it's one of the country's most prestigious boarding schools, and he basically infuriated the teachers because he was somebody who went out and brewed beer. He went to watch punk bands and didn't toe the line. And one of the things that was very challenging for Jeremy Bamber was that his classmates referred to him as bastard. So they called him literally the bastard. And the reason for that is obviously he's an illegitimate child, essentially. But that was so painful for him. He actually wrote in his diary after that occurred that the other students had learned of his adoption and that he never made another friend. So one can only imagine the devastation that would have on him. He's already dealing with the fact that his life has not got off to the easiest of starts. He's been given the trappings of money, but at the same point, he's not being accepted into his peer network. And people look down on him because he didn't have the ordinary experience of being born biologically to the parents who are bringing him up. And the idea that he's isolated to such a degree that he doesn't even make another friend, that's harrowing. Now, he does go down the line and achieve 7.0 levels at sixth form. So it's not as if this isn't somebody who's capable. It's just that for whatever reason, that schooling environment simply did not work out. Also, he did get up to a little bit of mischief. So he'd grown cannabis behind the cattle shed on the farm. Also, he had an affair with a married mother of 3. Well, you can imagine June's feelings and views on that, can't you? She'd be absolutely devastated. I mean, she's an upstanding member of the church and the community, and her young son is gallivanting around with a married mother of 3. That would never do. So there'll be tensions, there'll be frustrations, without a doubt, in the family, but equally, this is nothing unusual. Young people grow up, try to find themselves, and ultimately they make mistakes. That's part of being human and part of being a young person. There was somebody watching me now going, I have literally been a model child my entire life. And the parent was sat next to them going, you have literally been a model child your whole life. That would not be my parents. Neither of my parents, God rest his soul, my father, no way would either of them be like, yeah, total model of a child. Actually, my father probably would, because I think he just lived in some delusion in the end that really all of the stuff I'd done in the past was eradicated. But for most of us, you know, we make these mistakes and it's okay. Now, after he'd achieved his O-levels, he wanted to explore the world, so he went travelling. He spent time in New Zealand, he spent time in Australia. His father actually funded that. So again, the generosity of Neville is absolutely evident. And also, I guess that he's probably thinking that if he allows his son some wanderlust, then maybe he'll go and find himself, because it's good for independence, traveling. Don't get me wrong, most of us have to do it on a shoestring and we work our ways around the world. But arguably, if you've got the cash and you can send your kids out to see the world so that it benefits them on an independence level and they get to be excited about possibilities and they get to spend time in other cultures, it should be enriching. So essentially, I would imagine that was the motivation between Neville doing that. And whilst he was actually out in Australia and New Zealand, he actually spent time with Neville's cousins who were actually farmers. He took a diving course, he worked in restaurants, he worked in bars. So he was obviously engaging as much as he could in the cultural experiences along with the work experiences that those landscapes offered him. Now, when Jeremy Bamber came back to the UK, he ended up living in a house in Goldhanger. That house was owned by his parents, so they're still, I would say, footing the bill at this point. This is about 3.5 miles from where Whitehouse Farm is to where he grew up. Take about 15 minutes to cycle from Whitehouse Farm to Goldhanger. Nevill and June allowed him to live there completely rent-free, also gave him a job on the farm, but Apparently he was a bit problematic because, shall we say, he wanted more from the world. He didn't like the low wages. It's hard work working on a farm, isn't it? Apparently he liked to live a relatively lavish lifestyle, and he had a penchant, shall we say, for the finer things in life. And, you know, hard graft doesn't necessarily offer you that. And also, members of my family work with me and for me. And the truth is that sometimes that can be really challenging for them as well as it can for you, because it's a bit of a cooking pot of relationships and frustrations at times and projections of stress. And when you love the people that you also work with, understandably, the boundaries are slightly different, and you can act in a way that you wouldn't act like in front of an employer that was not related to you. So I would imagine that Jeremy Bamber at this point feels quite content in telling Neville that he doesn't want to do A, B, and C, and that would be deeply frustrating for Neville. Now, in 1974, Sheila, Jeremy Bamber's sister, she was attending St Godric's College in Hampstead. Again, this is a very, very nice area of the UK. Hampstead Heath is just gorgeous. She was undertaking a secretarial course. She was 17 years old at that time. And it's here that she ends up meeting 21-year-old Colin Caffell at a pub called the Three Horseshoes. And it's one of those scenarios that you see in Hollywood movies. They see each other across a crowded bar and almost immediately they fall in love. Colin actually said that it was absolutely for him love at first sight. He just said he was enchanted in the moment and that he genuinely felt that he had met his, quote, fairy tale princess. And with respect, Sheila was absolutely gorgeous. He described her as a stunning beauty with the biggest grey blue eyes he'd ever seen. And he said that she was just somebody who filled him with hope in that moment. And he also said that to him, she was more beautiful than all the girls in his wildest dreams and fantasies. So that's the level we're talking about. And we all know that we have love goggles on, don't we, when we first meet somebody, and the idiosyncrasies that we find really alluring can sometimes be problematic down the line, but initially we're just absolutely enchanted with everything that they do. But she is gorgeous. You just have to look at any of the photographs of her, and you can imagine that most men in the place that they met were probably looking in her direction and thinking, if only I had a chance. Now, Colin, he was studying at Camberwell School of Art. He actually went on to do a degree in ceramics and three-dimensional design. Now, I would say that their relationship, bear in mind they're young, and I always think that's really imperative, because when we talk about cases and we talk about relationships and we don't put an age context on it, often we can think, well, tumultuous relationship shouldn't ever be carried forward, you know, if there's toxicity in it and so on and so forth. But when you are young, particularly when you're under 20, for example, let's just be real about this. We often have toxicity in our relationships because we're just learning who we are. We're figuring out ourselves, and we're a lot more likely to engage in conflict. We haven't got to a point where we've got so much responsibility we can't really be bothered fighting about something that doesn't really seem to have any value in our world. But when you're younger, you can get hooked up and angry about things that 10 years down the line, it just will be water off a duck's back. So even though they do have a relatively tumultuous relationship, it doesn't mean that they didn't have a good relationship for a period of time. Now, Colin, after his studies, begins to work as an advertising sales executive, and Sheila, because she is absolutely striking looking, she starts working as a model. And in 1977, she becomes pregnant. Now, there is some suggestion that she was pregnant before this and she had an abortion, but she definitely became pregnant in 1977. At this point, the couple move in together. But as I said, the relationship is relatively turbulent. And actually, the quote that Colin Caffell actually said about their relationship was, quote, "Violence was just below the surface. There were even times we could have killed each other." Now, when Sheila got pregnant, June insisted that they get married. And they did in May that year at Chelmsford Registry Office. You can imagine, can't you? June, throughout Sheila growing up, has considered that she's a bit of a devil child. That's the quote that's used. That's the suggestion of the name that was given to Sheila by June. And you can see that in the moment that she finds out that her daughter is pregnant out of wedlock, that's going to be a big problem. So saying, you know, you're pregnant now, you're having this baby, you need to go and get signed legally into this relationship so that people around me, people who are God-fearing like myself, don't judge you harshly. And also bear in mind, one of the children that she's adopted, as in Jeremy Bamber, he was given to June because he was illegitimate, and she probably doesn't want any grandchild of her to meet the same fate. Now, soon after the ceremony, when they get married, it's really sad. The baby's actually stillborn. I cannot even begin to compute how that would feel. And for somebody like June, who's the grandmother, she's probably looking at this with that, as I said earlier on, pathologized perspective of good and evil and thinking, well, this person that I brought up, who I consider a devil child, has probably done something to deserve this. So I'm not imagining that there would have been that much sympathy and empathy, shall we say, coming in that direction. I'm not saying they wouldn't have been supportive in lots of other ways. I'm just saying there is an assumption there, because of what I've talked about so far, that that might be possible. Also, you can imagine on Sheila the way that that would feel, the absolute horror of having a stillbirth, and then another pregnancy ends in a miscarriage. So she must have been absolutely bereft. And Sheila apparently saw the losses as divine punishment, and she started to believe that she was actually evil. Now, I would say that's compounded by her experience growing up, where the mother who's bringing her up is basically talking to her in that way as well. Because clearly, if you have somebody telling you whilst you are growing through your challenging and developing years that there is something wrong with you, and then these horrible things happen to you, you could start to manifest that there is something deeply wrong with who you are, rotten to the core, for example. And I genuinely think that Sheila starts to manifest that belief system. Now, finally, in good news for her, on June the 22nd, 1979, she gives birth to Nicholas and Daniel, who are twins. But unfortunately, even though this should be an incredibly happy event, after so much grief and so much loss and so much turbulence, it seems that really the signalling of that birth and having two sons actually starts to unravel Colin and Sheila's marriage, and it begins to crumble, and eventually the pair get divorced in 1982. Colin said that the relationship basically deteriorated, quote, to the level of mutual abuse and accusations, and that they no longer saw each other in the form of radiant supernatural beings, but as an ogre and a witch. Colin later described his relationship with Sheila as an endless run of intense passions and stormy differences, pathos, pain, and wonder. He actually moved on pretty quickly with another model named Jan. So Sheila has now got two small babies, and she doesn't have a relationship and support, and she has struggled at times with her mental health. So that is a recipe for problems. It's as simple as that. Now, again, Nevill and June are deeply generous with her. So Sheila is bankrolled essentially so that she can get a flat in Maida Vale. And I would say as the years go down the line, Colin and Sheila do actually develop a relatively supportive friendship. And as her mental health starts to really unravel, he is really supportive of her. So even though initially when they break up, it's difficult and challenging, and we would all understand that. We've all been in situations like that. But arguably in this scenario, over the years, as co-parents, they start to ally with one another, and essentially they get on well, and he is really supportive of her. Now, on the 4th of August, 1983, Sheila ends up in a psychiatric hospital, and when she is there, she's described as agitated, she's described as depressed, and it's depressed in a, quote, paranoid way. So basically, she's in a psychotic state, and she's genuinely thinking in terms of good and evil, and she's got this idea that the devil's taken her over, and she feels like she can project the devil's evil onto other people, that she can project the devil's evil onto the people that she loves, and that she genuinely believes that she could make her kids violent by just thinking of things. When she is assessed, they diagnose her as having paranoid schizophrenia. Now, paranoid schizophrenia, I'm sure you all are aware of, but if I was to describe paranoid schizophrenia, it's about feeling that you can hear things, see things, smell things, understand things that other people don't understand. You can hear absolute clear voices that can often feel outside of yourself, so it feels like somebody else is in the room with you. You can smell, as I said, different odors. You can literally see things, see delusions, and often you can believe that people are listening to your thoughts. I have worked with somebody who had her own language that she wrote in her journals because she just didn't want anybody to understand what she was saying. She was that convinced that the radio waves and frequencies were being used so that they could hear every thought that she had. And also, it makes you believe that the world around you is completely untrustworthy. So all the people who might be trying to help you, you see as potential enemies. And if they're trying to give you things like medication, often you can be very suspicious of that because you think that potentially you're being poisoned. And when we talk about mental illness not leading to murder, because absolutely 99.999% of times that people are mentally unwell, they would never raise a hand to another human being. But of that very small percentage, when we see people who've carried out some pretty awful crimes, often it's linked to something like paranoid schizophrenia because of the fact that they're actually in a delusional and psychotic state at the time that they engage in the behaviours. And it is something that's really concerning if you're around children. Now, she gets treated and she gets discharged on September the 10th. And then after she's released, understandably, she has to check in with a psychiatrist, make sure that she's okay and that things are working out. She's seen as an outpatient by a psychiatrist called Dr. Ferguson. She's also prescribed stelazine and antipsychotic. So this is very much part of her pathway to being healed. You certainly will need an antipsychotic when you're dealing with these really troubling and difficult delusions. Now, around this time, Jeremy Bamber is dating a girl called Julie Mugford. She's a student at Goldsmith College in London. He's actually working as a barman in the evenings at a place called Sloppy Joe's in Colchester. Now, Julie happens to be working as a waitress in the same restaurant. He's there, she's there, the pair meet, the rest is history, essentially. Now, back to Sheila. On March the 3rd, 1985, she gets readmitted to hospital in a really anxious state. Again, the thoughts that she's going through at that moment in time are all about the concepts of good and evil. But it seems like on this particular occasion, it's more directly related to excessive religious ideas. So again, now we've got the Bible delusions, the idea of being spoken to through those pages and confirming these philosophies around what is actually being said in those words. And this again demonstrates that there is an unraveling where she is concerned. She was actually discharged a few weeks later on March 29th. At this point, they started giving her haloperidol. These are injections that she'd have every month, which is really helpful if you have somebody who's resistant to taking antipsychotics, for example. You can have an injection and it's a slow acting, which means that it can last a period of time, which means that the person who might be resistant to taking tablets because they're afraid they're being poisoned won't have to resist because it's essentially in their system. So that is an antipsychotic that basically manages hallucinations and delusions. Also has, I would say, tranquilizing properties. At this point, understandably, she is looking after two children, so it's difficult for her. So Nicholas and Daniel end up moving in with their dad. They move there full time at this point. And Colin Caffell believed that Sheila's mental health basically had a correlation declining after visiting her direct family. And in particular, the decline happened if she spent time with her mother. And he corroborates the suggestion of those who treated June, which is that she had this belief of what was right and wrong, and it was absolutely rigid. There was no grey area, and that this religious excess that June displayed was really problematic. It had a direct impact on Sheila's mental health and the way that she dealt with life after that. And like I said, when you're being brought up and being told that you are a devil child by somebody that you're meant to be able to trust and love, that is wounding. And if you have fractures in your foundation, anything that is then going to influence that fracture further and amplify that fracture further is going to be problematic for you. And he actually said that as a father, he was worried for his children because his sons, his beautiful twin boys, they were afraid of grandma's, quote, religious mania. She was constantly getting them to pray and kneel and just essentially be very godlike when she was around them. And clearly with your grandma, what you really want is them to just, I don't know, buy you sweets and take you somewhere nice and treat you. I'm a bit old school like that. Grandmas should always have a bag of sweets upstairs that you can just bob off to and grab a few packs for, as my grandma was like. You know, she didn't have a lot. My gran, she lived in housing, association housing for 70 years of her life. So she was not a rich woman. But let me tell you, when I went round to my nan's, No matter how old I was, I could run upstairs and just behind a wardrobe, she'd always have a plastic bag and sometimes there'd be Mentos in it. Sometimes there'd be Uncle Joe's mint balls, my particular favourite. And on occasion, there'd be a pick and mix bag from the local market. It was questionable and sometimes the sweets did taste a little bit off. What I'm saying is, grandmas, that's what you want in them, isn't it? You feel safe with them. They don't have you kneeling, doing some kind of weird religious ritual stuff. It's scary for children. And like I said, I'm telling you that to give you what Sheila is experiencing and enduring when she already has some deeply problematic mental health issues. And Colin actually wrote later that he blamed the church local to Whitehouse Farm for much of the family's mental illness. So Colin Caffell really does have some issues around how June parented and grandparented, but also who was responsible for, shall we say, indoctrinating those beliefs. And I think that's probably a word that we would use appropriately in this manner. Now, in December 1984, bear in mind, in the background, Jeremy's met Julie, things are going okay, and they are getting engaged. So again, this should be a really happy time because at least Jeremy and Julie are getting things together. According to all intents and purposes, they should be planning a wedding and things should be going well. But they're not gonna. And they're not gonna because of what happens on August the 4th, 1985. So on this particular day, Colin Caffell drops Sheila and both of their sons off at Whitehouse Farm. Again, testament to the fact that these two were co-parenting effectively. Now, essentially, they were going to go stay there for a week. And after that week, Colin was going to pick up Nicholas and Daniel and was going to take them on holiday to Norway. So a week with the mum and then a lovely trip out to Norway. And you can imagine, can't you, as those children were dropped off, probably a little bit concerned about the fact they've got to spend a week with grandma in particular and granddad, who's lovely, but nonetheless with grandma who can be a bit challenging, but also a nice time with mum on a farm. There's lots of lovely things to do when you're free and wild to roam. So they probably have a bit of trepidation, a bit of excitement, but also just knowing that they're going to get to go to Norway after a week, they must have been really excited about that. But on the 7th of August, 1985, everything comes crashing down. And I mean, crashing down in the most spectacular of ways. So around 3:30 a.m. in the morning, Jeremy Bamber phones the police station. At this point, he says to them, "You've got to help me. My father's rang me and he said, please come over. Your sister has gone crazy and has got the gun." He also told the police, listen, her 6-year-old twin sons are asleep upstairs. He said at that point, after he'd had that conversation, the line had gone dead, hadn't been able to get back through to him. He said to the person that he was speaking to, reporting this to, that his father sounded absolutely terrified. And then he also informed them that Sheila, his sister, had got a history of psychiatric illness. Now, the police actually met Jeremy at Whitehouse Farm. He arrived just behind them. It's around 4 a.m. when he arrives behind them. 2 of the officers at this point tell Jeremy Bamber to follow them. And that's because the Whitehouse Farm lies just around the bend and it's been concealed by tall trees. So they obviously can't see it and they want to get there slowly. So they end up cutting across a field to the front. And one of the officers said that they saw a shadow at the window. And because they saw this shadow at the window, they actually ducked behind a hedge because they thought they might get shot. None came. So at this point, they go back to the patrol officer, but they're that convinced that somebody is armed and dangerous at the window and that potentially has seen them, that they actually want to call for backup. So the officers do that. They go and ask for reinforcements. So they don't immediately enter the house. Instead, they watch the house. Jeremy Bamber is with them at this point, and they're basically waiting outside. At this point, they can't actually hear any noise from the house, but they can hear a dog barking. So that's how they know that there is volume in the home, because they have a comparison, which is they can hear a dog, but they can't hear anything else. Now, at the car with the police officers, apparently, Bamber said that the previous night, before he'd gone home from work at the farm, he'd actually taken his father's .22 and Schuss rifle out of the actual cabinet that it was in to shoot rabbits. And he said, I left the actual gun in the kitchen and it was loaded. And apparently he said, oh God, I hope she hasn't done anything silly. This is what's been reported. Also, he was constantly saying, can you please go in? Can you please go and see what's happening? He was quoted as saying, they're all the family I've got, but these officers refused to go in without backup. Also, telephone engineers apparently found out that the kitchen phone was off the hook, and they were apparently able to listen in through the phone, but it was silent. Now, at 5 a.m, when a van arrived, which brought all the squad of armed officers, they then still remained outside of the home for 2.5 hours. So we've got a lot of time passing. I mean, it is quite harrowing to imagine that if there was somebody in the home with a weapon, all of this time has passed and there are children in there, potentially at deep risk. But officers remained in place and they're on a bullhorn calling to Sheila, asking her to surrender. But again, the only thing that they hear is the dog, which is continually yapping. So it's about 7:30 a.m. that a raid team is authorised to enter. They do this very slowly. They're kind of inching forward. And when they arrive to kind of look in and see what's going on, one officer actually says that he saw a woman and a man on the kitchen floor. So 2 people on the kitchen floor. As they enter, that isn't what they finally see, because it seems that there's only now one person in the kitchen, and that's the person who is Neville. He's dead on the floor. He's slumped across an overturned chair, and essentially this is going to begin the very grim discovery that there are no survivors in the home. And it's very obvious to the officers who cast their eyes over that scene that something very violent has played out. The room's in disarray. One of the ceiling's lampshades has been broken. There's sugar, there's broken plates, there's blood all over the floor. Also, there's chairs and stools, they've been turned over. The phone was indeed off the hook, and there were actual bullet shells next to it. Now, Neville, massive case of overkill. He'd been shot 8 times. He had wounds to his head, to his shoulder. He had a wound to his lip. He had another to his lower jaw. In fact, his jaw was severely fractured and there was damage because of that to his larynx, neck and teeth. He had a broken nose. He had black eyes. His left wrist and forearm, they were bruised. And he also had 3 circular burn marks to his back. He had linear bruising on his cheeks and right forearm, and that indicated that he'd been hit with a long object, such as indeed a gun. Now, it was later theorised that he'd been shot in the bedroom, but he'd managed to go down the stairs and into the kitchen, so obviously trying to remove himself from the situation. And they believe that here is where the altercation took place, and it's where he was beaten and finally killed. There was, of course, as I've noted, no sign of the woman that the officer had reported he had seen in the kitchen. Now, when the police actually search upstairs, they discover the most horrific sight, which is the bodies of Nicholas and Daniel. These are 6-year-old twin boys. It's inconceivable, isn't it, to imagine that their lives have been cut short in such a brutal manner. Both of them have been shot. They were in the beds, so the only thing we can pray for is that it was quick. And certainly Daniel, who was shot 5 times in the back of the head, he actually still had his thumb in his mouth. So it's likely that he died when he was asleep. Obviously, his brother may not have been as lucky. He was shot 3 times in the face. So it may have been that he came round and that's why he was shot in the face and not the back of the head. And it's just brutal beyond belief to imagine what officers saw when you imagine being shot at 6 years old, 3 times in your face. Then in the master bedroom, they came across the bodies of June and Sheila. Apparently the whole family had been wearing their pajamas. June and Sheila was wearing night dresses. June was apparently covered completely in blood. She'd been shot 7 times. She was shot in her forehead, in her head, in her neck, in her chest, in her right knee. Actually, a bullet had been fired between her eyes. And then 6 more had been shot through her head, neck, chest and limbs. And the wounds to her forehead and head would have actually caused her to die quickly. So again, massive overkill. It seems that she'd actually been shot in bed while she was lying down. But somehow, in spite of the horrendous injury, she'd managed to stagger around to the bedroom door. And at that point, she'd succumbed to those injuries. Now, Sheila, she had far less gun wounds. She had 2 gunshot wounds, so to her throat basically. And the rifle was lay on her chest. It was pointing in the direction of her neck. Also, there was a Bible next to her body that apparently belonged to June, and it was open to Psalm 51 to 55. And the line that it read was, "Save me from blood guiltiness." That was underscored with a streak of red. Now, she had no other injuries to suggest that she'd been involved in any physical altercation, and officers actually described her feet and her hands as perfectly clean, which is strange when you imagine the bloodiness of the environment around her. Now, a guy called Detective Hammersley, he said that although she had some blood staining to the back of her right hand, her hands were clean with the nails intact. And the autopsy actually revealed that the first wound was actually lower down on her neck, and though it would have been fatal, one of the things that was clear was it wouldn't have caused instant death. So she would have died, but it wouldn't have killed her immediately. Now, the second shot, that was higher up, that would have been almost immediately fatal. Now, she was shot while sitting up, and she'd fallen back after the second shot. Also, there was hemorrhaging inside her neck, and that supported the view that the lower bullet wound had indeed occurred first. Now, her clothes didn't have extensive blood staining, and that meant that there was no way that she stood up after the gunshot wound happened first. So both of those gunshot wounds occurred while she was sat down. Now, it has been hypothesized that the first injury wouldn't have prevented her from actually getting up. So she'd chosen not to get up, not that she couldn't have got up. It couldn't be determined whether Sheila had shot herself or whether she'd been shot by someone else. So just to put that out there, in the initial investigation, that's what came through, that it couldn't be said whether she had shot herself or whether she'd been shot by someone else. Now, understandably, we have Jeremy Bamber, who's at the scene. He's in a scenario where he's been waiting for the police to go in. Apparently, he's been asking the police to go in to save his family. And now he's about to get the worst news ever. So when he's told about the murders, he's described as being in a state of shock. A police officer actually went up to him and said, "We've found everybody dead." And he apparently at this point closed his eyes, started to cry. And another officer who was beside him basically tried to comfort him. And Bamber was recorded as saying, "You said everything would be all right." And the officer said, "I know, we like to think things will work out." Now, when a police doctor actually saw Jeremy, he suggested they should go for a walk, which we can understand in a situation where there is nothing that can be changed. This man is in a deep sense of traumatic shock, according to those people around him, getting him up and walking him about and just trying to keep the momentum of him just figuring out how to breathe in that moment could be helpful if you accompany them on a walk. Jeremy was apparently in so much shock, he actually said, "Why can't my father come too?" At that point, he just broke down, and officers said that he was retching, he was being sick essentially. He then apparently said, "Sheila ought to be in a nut house for what she's done." And like I said, this is whilst apparently he's in a real state retching. Now, that scene that the officers walked into, it's grisly, it's macabre, it's harrowing. There are children who've literally been executed in the most deplorable of ways, and starting to piece together how that could have played out is inconceivably difficult anyway. But almost automatically, they do feel that they're dealing with a murder-suicide. One of the reasons is that the story that's being told about Sheila's mental health seems to align with what could have played out. Also, the way the gun had been found on Sheila's body, along with the Bible, that also tends to give an impression that that's the person who's carried out the attack. Now, a guy called Detective Taff, he's at this point ordered to lead the police inquiry. So he goes about examining the windows, examining the doors, and he actually determines at that point that the house had been locked from the inside. Then the police surgeon and the coroner's office, they examine the bodies, and they indeed confirm that Sheila appeared to have killed her family before turning the gun on herself. Bear in mind, as I've said, Sheila sustained these 2 gunshot wounds, one to her neck, the other under her chin. Like I said, first one isn't immediately fatal, but the second one was, according to the pathologist, consistent with suicide. Now, as more detectives arrive, this particular detective, Jones, is telling them, look, we're dealing with a clear-cut murder-suicide. It's horrific, but it's real. This happened. We've got the suspect. We've got the attacker. She's dead. So the officers take this verbatim and they start sorting out the scene, because this is harrowing, isn't it? When you have family members who are going to have to enter that crime scene and are going to have to deal with things in the house, the police want to help. They want to make sure that things get tidied up a little bit. So that's what they start doing. They remove the bloody mattresses. They remove the carpets. They take the bodies for cremation. So if you're thinking about getting it wrong in this moment, that's a big thing to get wrong. Because even if you change your mind about how this could play out as a crime, that's all vital evidence. So it goes just as badly for Sheila, reputationally, having this pinned on her, as it would do for someone else if there is no crime scene data that's available that could exonerate her or indeed somebody else. So arguably, that from the very get-go is deeply problematic with any investigation. Like I said, if it was Sheila, then surely some diligence about making sure that that scene wasn't contaminated, making sure that that scene was really explored diligently, that would be really important, so people can say, yes, it definitely was Sheila. Or indeed, if somebody else comes into, shall we say, the line of fire, you want all that information there so that if they're saying, I didn't do it, you can prove that they did. Or indeed, they can prove that they didn't. Either way, pretty catastrophic when these kind of things play out in circumstances where I would say become highly chaotic, because the police are just trying to create some order in the crime scene by getting rid of all the things that could actually be really powerfully important if anything goes to court because people change their mind and don't think Sheila did it. Now, the press are not helpful. They really aren't. They start running stories because, this is a big deal. You have this gorgeous young woman, Sheila. She's stunning. She's what you expect to see in movies and magazines. You don't expect to see her face on the front of a newspaper because she's murdered her own children. It's tantalizing for the press. They want people to buy papers, and this is the kind of story that sells a lot of papers. So they start running these stories about how Sheila's suffered from a nervous breakdown that's probably triggered the massacre, and also that Sheila's responsible is then widely accepted as the truth, which makes sense because people believe what they say in the papers. We don't do it as much these days, but certainly I was somebody who believed what I saw in the papers for a long time. Nowadays, I question everything, but understandably, at this point, people are looking at it and saying, yeah, that's what's happened. Also, the fact that the police, who are led by DCI Taft Jones, they believe also that theory from the offset of the investigation. That means, like I said, that mistakes are made regarding the crime scene. A lot of evidence wasn't preserved appropriately or accurately. And Colin Caffell later wrote that the police had basically made up their mind that Sheila was responsible for the murders, and so they moulded their investigations accordingly. Now, Jeremy Bamber told Colin that there had been an argument in the evening before the murders. And that argument had apparently arrived because Nevill and June were questioning Sheila's capability of parenting her sons, because she had these mental health issues. And they said that they were going to try to arrange to give custody of her children to a local Christian foster family. So that way, basically, they'd be able to spend more time with their grandsons. Now, I'm not sure how realistic that would be, because you have somebody like Colin Caffell who's very engaged in his children's lives. He loves his kids. No matter what Nevill and June think, if you were kind of sitting there turning up a week later to take your kids on holiday and they're like, by the way, we've fostered your kids, you'd be like, oh, what? Yeah, we just fostered your kids. We want to see them more often. So we thought we'd just foster them. That is domineering, isn't it? Beyond belief. If that is the case, that is an absolute overreach, power dynamic rise in the way that you would treat your child and your grandchildren. I mean, it's scary as well for any mother, particularly a mother who's been bankrolled to some degree by her parents, to be told this is what's going to happen, because they're the people who are potentially paying your bills. And now you're in a really precarious situation because they're basically saying, well, if you don't do A, then B is going to happen. If you don't let us foster your children, we're going to cut you off potentially. And so you couldn't see that this could be a real trigger for anyone if it genuinely played out. So I guess at this point, Jeremy Bamber is saying to Colin Caffell, listen, this could be a reason why she snapped. But from the get-go, a lot of people have got doubts about whether Sheila was the person who committed the murders. Now, despite all the senior officers saying that this was the case, there are rumblings, there are tensions. People are not happy with this apparently open and shut case that they're having presented to them. And actually, with respect to some of the officers, they feel that way. And certainly the people who know Sheila, so most of the friends and family who know her, they said they didn't believe that she was capable of the killings. So June's sister, somebody called Pamela Boutflower, she said that she'd never been a violent person. And the rest of the family kind of agreed with her at that point. And one of the reasons as to why the suspicion was raised was the fact that Sheila supposedly had managed to subdue her father Neville during the violent altercation. Bear in mind, when the police arrived at the scene, as I've said, there is a clear scenario where Neville hasn't just been shot, he's been assaulted. Remember, there's long marks on his head that makes it look like potentially a gun or an object of some sort has been used to beat him. So he hasn't just been killed by shooting, he's been killed by shooting and a violent assault. And they're imagining, how could Sheila, this slight young woman, have carried out such brutality? He's 61 years old, yes, but he's really physically fit, he's really healthy, he's working as a farmer, he's really well built, and he was 6'4". That's going to be tough for anyone to actually overcome this particular man. I mean, farmers are strong. They really are. So he's much stronger than Sheila. She was around 5'7.5" tall. He would have towered above her. And so a lot of people really find it hard to believe that Sheila had been able to overpower him at all. Also, what close family members said was that she didn't have the skill, she didn't have the experience with a gun, she wouldn't have known how to shoot so many bullets, particularly bullets on targets. And her cousin, Anne Eaton, who from the get-go, I would say, was very involved in speaking to the police about her thoughts, she said that Sheila had really bad hand-eye coordination and she, quote, didn't know one end of the barrel of a gun to another. She also said that she genuinely didn't believe that Sheila would have known how to reload the gun, which the killer would have had to do on numerous occasions because of the number of bullets that were fired and also the wounds that were sustained by the victims. When they did swabs on Sheila's hands, they showed low levels of lead, but there was a much higher amount that would be expected if she had loaded the gun. Or at least if she had loaded the gun and not washed her hands after. Because understandably, if you load a gun, you'll have residue, particularly a high level if you're doing what I've just talked about, reloading and shooting. But I guess we do have to bring in the idea that it is possible to wash your hands, even your body, after you've carried out some pretty heinous actions. So just leaving that to ruminate in your thoughts, because we have to bring in every possibility when we're thinking about reasonable doubt, or indeed whether there isn't any. Also, her shoes had no sugar on them. There was sugar spilled all over the kitchen. And I guess another thing that kind of sat badly with people was that Sheila had shot herself twice. So ultimately people are thinking, why would you shoot yourself twice? And arguably in suicides, we don't tend to see people shooting themselves multiple times. It has happened. But people are starting to question, does that make sense? Did she load the gun, shoot herself, damage herself fatally, even though it would have taken time for her to bleed out? But then, in spite of what was happening, the pain, the fear, the horror, all of those things colliding, that she actually did it again. So again, you can understand why people are asking those questions. So why would somebody so fatally injured pull the trigger a second time? Anne Eaton, like I said, who's really there from the get-go, that's Jeremy Bamber's cousin. She is suspicious from the start. Now, I've got to bring it in. Her father, Robert Boutflower, he was married to June's sister. He was somebody, I would say, who had a very bad idea around who Jeremy Bamber was from the get-go. He didn't like him. I think he thought he was a waster. I think he thought he was lazy. I think he thought it was a bit odd. We're talking about a time where, new romantic styles are out and people are looking a little bit more metrosexual as guys. He didn't like the fact Jeremy Bamber wore makeup sometimes and seemed a bit flaky on a masculine level. I think that was where Robert Boutflower came from in his perception of Jeremy Bamber. He felt that he was a degenerate, and he also said that he had a constant craving for money. Now, I will say the Bambers and the Boutflowers, they weren't really close. So we're not talking about this really united, connected family, but they're related and they did have some shared business interests. And one of those shared business interests was the Osea Road Vacation Park that's on the River Blackwater. Now, one of the reasons that Anne Eaton is really concerned from the get-go is that she feels that, understandably, Bamber is now going to be in control of a lot of the assets that belong to the family. And I hate to break things down to this kind of level, but we all know one of the most contentious things about people's lives is when they die, and everyone's like, I want that, and wills can be really problematic, and families can fall out, and so on and so forth. There is nothing as terrible as money where families are concerned. A lot of us will relate to that. And I would say that Anne Eaton, from the very get-go, has some concerns about how Bamber is going to deal with his inheritance and how that is going to affect her and her family. Again, just putting it out there because we have to explore every single avenue and every different perception and perspective where we're looking at crime. Now, she gets upset because when Jeremy Bamber is actually being spoken to by the police the next day, he starts to talk about his mother's mental illness and how she was hyper-religious, how she had this rigidity about good and evil, and Anne didn't like it. She felt that it was a way of throwing June under the bus at a really harrowing time. It wasn't necessary to discuss that, and it provoked something in her. Now, apparently, after this, and Anne had taken a lot of notes during listening to Jeremy Bamber speaking to the police, she'd gone back, relayed all of this to the Boutflowers. They all get together, and they all decide Sheila's not the killer. She's a really unlikely killer, and if they're going to think about somebody who's more significant as a suspect, well, that's Jeremy Bamber. And they're that moved by this idea that they end up going to the police station to discuss their fears, to tell the police, look, you're looking in the wrong direction. We know Sheila, we know Jeremy, and we know if it comes down to who would kill, it would be Jeremy and it would be for gain. So that's their mindset. Now, apparently, that particular meeting did not go well. Detective Taft Jones was actually really annoyed with them. And you can imagine, can't you? You've kind of said, this is an open and shut case. It's a murder-suicide. It's terribly sad. It's awful that it's happened. But at the end of the day, it's done. It's over. Get on with the grieving process. And you have a family who are not schooled in your discipline, who don't have any qualifications in your field or experience within your field. And they're coming in and saying, basically, you got it wrong. If you were a police officer who is long in the tooth, as he was, you are likely going to feel upset by your professionality and conduct being questioned, because this is a big problem for you if you happen to have done something wrong. It can be a blight on your character, it can reputationally be very damaging. Hey, it can even cost you your job. But this is where the family are going. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that they're watching Jeremy Bamber and they're feeling like he's not acting as they feel he should be acting after losing basically his entire family, because this is a really devastating time. And even police officers who've been around Jeremy Bamber are agreeing that there's just something a little bit off about him. So some officers are actually saying he'd been remarkably calm when he was waiting outside Whitehouse Farm. But I do want to have it stated at that point, just as a counter, as I said earlier on, when the police officer came out and said, your whole family's dead, Jeremy Bamber said, but you said it was all going to be okay. So it could be that he's calm in an unusual way, or it could be that he's ultimately absolutely trusted that the police are going to be able to sort this out, doesn't believe for a second that his sister is capable of murdering his family and her children, and therefore just thought he was dealing with a potential siege situation where she had become destabilised and he just had to wait it out until the police went in, took control, got them all out safely. The fact that he was calm could absolutely play into that psychology, particularly when they make a big deal of the fact that Neville's this really big guy and can handle himself, and she is this petite woman. So you can see that Jeremy Bamber might be considering it in that mindset. Of course, she'll be fine, it won't be a problem, etc. But again, some of the police officers are saying it just felt off. In fact, one detective said he'd not been happy with the way that Jeremy had carried himself after the murders because He had basically done strange things, and after the murders and the day after, when the police had gone back with him to his own place where he lived, he'd actually made a bacon sandwich and made himself a cup of tea. And these are things that just didn't sit well, because they were like, that just feels extraordinarily weird to watch somebody who's just lost their entire family just think about a bacon sandwich. Again, though, I want to bring in the fact that that does seem a little bit off. But when you are dealing with an absolutely abnormal experience, sometimes you just want normality and you do things that try to make you feel normal. And I'll give you an example of how this can play out, how you can look at something and think, oh, that seems a little bit strange. I worked with somebody who lost their father-in-law in horrendously tragic circumstances. And the next time I saw them, they said that that evening they went home and they basically insisted that the man, their husband, who just lost their parent, had sex with them because they felt they required intimacy. This completely abnormal reaction for many of us, because I think we can all agree, a lot of us would find that a little bit strange to insist that our partner sleeps with us and has intimacy with us when they're dealing with the most horrific trauma. But what she was saying was, I needed him to know I'm still here, I'm still solid. I needed him to know in this abominable horror and loss, I was here, I was present, I was loving. And I get it. It just didn't make sense to me, but I get it. So I've made sense of that from understanding her perspective. So that bacon sandwich being made, it seems off, but equally everybody resolves and reacts differently where trauma is concerned. Now, understandably, when a family are massacred in this way, there's a lot of legal things that need to be dealt with, and that's not just with the police, that's to do with the financial affairs of the family. Jeremy Bamber is set to inherit a great deal of money, but he's not the only person that will be affected because the family's in business with other people. So on August 10th, 1985, family members actually go to Whitehouse Farm. They go with a guy called Basil Cock. He's the executor of the estate. This isn't a day where Bamber has gone. Apparently he was saying he didn't want to be there at that moment in time. Now, whilst the family are there, David Boutflower, that's June's nephew, he goes into the downstairs office, looks into the gun cupboard, and right at the back of the cupboard, he discovers the sound moderator and also the telescopic sights for the gun. And there were actually witnesses to him finding these, so it's not disputed. So Anne Eaton, who is his sister, she's there. His father's there, Basil Cock's there, and also the farm secretary. So there's a lot of witnesses that see this happen. Also, it's noted that there's damage to the silencer, and also there's something on it. They basically thought it was a mix of blood and red paint, and they then go and inform the police about what they'd found that evening. And this is something that creates a curveball in the case. Now, on August 12, 1985, Detective Sergeant Jones comes to Anne's house and collects the silencer. She's packaged it up, she's stored it at her home to keep it safe, and at this point, the detective notices that there's a short grey hair attached to it, but apparently this hair isn't able to be found when the moderator is given to the Forensic Science Service for analysis. She's a bit weird, but nonetheless, it's disappeared. It's also found that there's a considerable, so that's the quote, a considerable amount of blood inside the silencer. And the forensic scientist at this point said it was likely that Sheila had been shot whilst the moderator was on the rifle. So that conclusion is apparently reached because the blood in the moderator is the same group as Sheila Caffell. So now they're thinking, well, how did that happen? How would she have been able to have that silencer on there when she shot herself twice, didn't get up and died in that spot? How did that levitate itself towards his apparent cupboard? Also, there was no blood in the barrel of the gun. Now, a firearms expert later testified that Sheila had been shot whilst the silencer was attached to the gun, referring to the blood on the moderator as a back spatter. Now, if that's true, that's significant information, isn't it? Because like I said, the silencer ends up back in the cupboard. She couldn't have done that. She couldn't have shot herself and then put the silencer away in the cupboard. And the fact that Sheila was shot with the silencer that's fitted to the gun, that also reinforces the view, therefore, that she didn't kill herself, because the length of the rifle with the moderator attached would make it really impossible for her to reach the trigger whilst the barrel was aimed at her neck. Now, the discovery of that silencer containing Sheila's blood gave real weight to the theory that Sheila had not been the one who committed the murders. Now we get to August the 14th, 1985. At this point, a crime officer comes to Whitehouse Farm, wants to inspect the mantel of the kitchen. Relatives of the Bambers had actually inspected the house after seeing what they'd of course thought was red paint on the moderator of that gun. And they believed, having done a search of the house, it apparently matched the red paint of the kitchen mantel above the Aga. So at this point, the crime officer takes samples from marks found on the mantel, and it is found that the paint matches the paint found on the silencer. I will say, that seems like a lot of diligent detective work, that the police didn't find any marks on the mantel when they were looking around and they didn't find the silencer. Just seems strange to me. If I was doing a search of a house, just a very basic search, even if I thought I knew what had happened, I'd be searching every nook and cranny. You want to make absolutely sure that you're getting the right result. But no, it's been down to Anne and her family to do all this detective work and come up with a whole new theory about how this murder has played out. Now, in addition to this, that same crime investigator took casts of the marks on the shelf, and it was actually found that these indents could have been caused by the silencer. So all this is going on in the background. But of course, we also have to think about what's happening with the bodies of the family who've been murdered. So on August the 16th, their funerals arrive. And first of all, the funeral of Sheila, Nevill and June Bamber takes place. At that funeral, Jeremy Bamber was absolutely beside himself. His legs were buckling, he was shaking with sobs, he was racked with grief, he's supported by his girlfriend at this point, he's just struggling towards the hearses. And apparently this really irked his relatives. They felt that he was acting. They'd actually asked the police to bug the funeral cars because they thought that maybe during the way onto the actual crematorium, he might confess what he'd done. And they said that as the procession pulled away, he basically gave them a smile. And again, it's really easy to interpret that as a psychopath, isn't it? Oh, Jupiter's delight, looking at the family, giving a bit of a nod and a smile, letting them know, got away with it. But equally, I've been to lots of funerals, sadly, including the most traumatic one of my own dad, who died in the most horrific of circumstances, and I smiled a lot. I didn't feel like smiling. It was just a reassurance to people. I wanted them to know I was here, I was okay, I'm going to be okay, I'm smiling, I'm dying inside. But I don't think that a smile depicts guilt. And that's not because I've got any bias in this case. It's just that the knowing smile. How is a smile knowing? That's your interpretation and perception of it. But apparently the family thought to themselves, this is him letting us know that he thinks he's got away with it. And after the funeral, I would say that he does things that I would not have done. And I think that, again, it isn't helpful when the eyes of the world are looking at you and after the funeral, you're not really present. So apparently after the funerals of his mother, his father and his sister, he goes to a local Caribbean restaurant, he gets champagne and drinks with friends and his girlfriend, and then they go on a windsurfing holiday. And I understand that if I was dealing with the slings and arrows of grief in that moment, the last thing I'd think about was a windsurfing holiday. And it does make you seem detached, disassociated from the actual pain that you should be enduring. But then they do come back. They come back on the 19th of August. That's when the funerals of Nicholas and Daniel occur. And just think about the poor father. He's lost his ex-partner and his two gorgeous sons. Sons that they tried so hard to get after so much heartbreak. And now he's literally saying goodbye to them because they've been murdered so brutally. And bear in mind, after that, even though Jeremy Bamber and his girlfriend come home, they then go off to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to buy weed. So they're not acting how we would expect. It's not typical of grieving people. So the rest of the family are now absolutely convinced that he's fully responsible. And it's getting more momentum. People are starting to question whether Sheila's guilty at all, or whether indeed she is the fall guy for this horrendous killing. Now, after Robert Bellflower actually appeals to the Chief Constable of the Essex Police about their theories, about the suspicions, it ends up with a high-ranking officer being assigned to review all the evidence, which is good because families don't want to have questions. Now, the results come back, and those results at this point say that they confirm everything pointed to Sheila. So this high-ranking officer who's been assigned to look at all the evidence and go through it very, very effectively, they're saying, no, it's sad, but we've got the right person. It was Sheila. But it isn't going to go quite as simply as that. Because on September the 7th, 1985, everything changes. Because you know Julie Mugford, you know Joey Bamber's girlfriend, stroke fiancé, you know the one who went on the windsurfing break after the funerals and then went to Amsterdam to score weed after the little boy's funerals. Yeah, she isn't a happy puppy. And she ends up on that date going and speaking to the police. And she says, you know what? I haven't been honest with you. I need to give you an honest statement. And there it is, Prickle. An honest statement? You've been lying to us about something so serious? 5 people have been murdered. Are you now telling us that your statement wasn't true? So then she really starts to unravel and she starts to tell her side of the story.